Thank you. Um, so I would like to introduce Harold Heft, who's a colleague of mine in Princeton at the Evergreen Forum, where he leads a course called Science in the News. Harold is a retired automotive and defense industry executive. He's also an Air Force veteran. He holds undergraduate degrees in psychology and philosophy from the Loyola University of Chicago, where he studied pediatric autism, sensory perception, and the philosophy of science. Harold's graduate research at the University of Chicago investigated the physiology of color perception. He later returned to academia at Loyola to focus on business ethics, arguing against the existence of corporate moral agency. This morning, let me also note that Harold is really absolutely fascinated, not only by scientific research and theory, but by the underlying humanity and ethics of the scientific enterprise. This morning, he will talk about autistic syndrome disorder, a condition that deeply challenges our everyday perceptions of being human and how those perceptions are playing out in autism research and treatment. Harold, thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Hope everybody can see that. Good morning. This is a talk that is going to have a lot of information in it, so I'm going to zoom through a lot, and I look forward to your questions afterwards. I think most of us have acquaintances or family members who are autistic or at some level of the spectrum, so some of this may be familiar to you. So I'm going to cover a lot of information. I'm going to describe autism. I'm going to describe its symptoms. But it's important to note that there's controversy now about how those descriptions should be worded and how those symptoms or traits should be worded. So some of this talk is about how dealing with autism or ASD is changing because of the concern about language. I'll talk about the diagnosis, hypothetical causes, treatment and management, and then go more deeply into the language controversy. Autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, deficits in interaction, social interaction and social communication, repeated patterns, what's called stimming, very narrow siloed interests or activities, and paradoxically, either hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input. The earliest researchers in this treated it as a medical problem. It was a disorder, had symptoms that had to be treated. But historically, that meant institutionalizing the children. And they were subjected to physical punishment, electric shock, food restriction, and in some cases, even lobotomy. But since the 60s, the characterization of autism has changed because of research, scientific research, because of some successes in treatment, and also because some people who have autism have started to contribute to our understanding of it by talking about their experience from the inside. Along with this change, the language conflict has emerged, and the debate is ongoing, and it's affecting research, affecting treatment, and impacting government policies related to autistic individuals. The debate is grounded in the belief that word choices can impact the subjects of research, the design of that research, and the interpretation of the experimental results. The accusations often characterize certain terms as ableist. And ableist is a term that's parallel is sexist, racist, and so on, that the language is inherently biased toward abled individuals while downgrading disabled individuals like those with autism. Describing autism as a disorder instead of a difference is only the tip of the iceberg of this conflict and this controversy. I'm going to toe the line on both sides of this. I'm going to use autism and ASD, symptoms and traits throughout this. I'm not taking one side or another until I give my conclusion at the end. So. Until 2013, autism was categorized as one of several developmental disorders. The American Psychiatric Association's DSM, some of you may be familiar with that. That's what psychiatrists and psychologists use to help them diagnose their clients and patients. And the ICD from the World Health Organization considered a number of different syndromes and situations, autism, Kanner syndrome, Asperger's, and these all overlap. So it was very difficult to diagnose one versus the other. But currently, both the ICD and DSM take what's called a spectrum approach. And it's a much more restricted definition, and actually fewer people actually qualify for a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. But both the ICM and the DSM still consider it a developmental disorder. The American version also talks about it being related to brain development specifically, but the European and WHO model says it's a behavioral diagnosis that needs to be made, and don't talk about what the causes might be. Now, when we talk about spectrum, we shouldn't be thinking about it from not severe to severe. Basically, the idea is that autistic syndrome consists of a number of different traits or symptoms that each may appear to one degree more or less severe. So here we have depression, fixations, noise sensitivity, poor eye contact. There's several symptoms like that. And any given individual with autism may have less severe or more severe symptoms in each of these areas. So it's important not to think of the syndrome as being a spectrum from okay to horrible. So the spectrum approach has the advantage of joining different conditions that were previously considered separate. And it appears to be not a unitary disorder, but rather a syndrome composed by subgroups. Each of those subgroups, as I said, may represent a different level of severity. So some individuals with autism are verbal, but some are not verbal. Some are brilliant, particularly idiot savants. I don't like that name, but savants. And then others are have severe intellectual deficits. This is a list of several of the common traits amongst ASD. And many of you may be familiar with this: avoidance of eye contact, reduced interest in other children, difficulty playing games, hyper or hyposensitivity, resistance to changes in routine, and what's called stimming, which are repetitive, limited, and otherwise unusual usage of movement. The onset and progression of autism is fairly well understood. If we look at this green line, hard to see it, this line here, this is time in months during the development of a child, and this is the developmental progress that's made. A typical child will continue to progress throughout the first 36 months. But there are three basic types of autism progression and onset. One is early onset, where from even before 12 months, there are deficits that can be observed. Late onset, there's normal development until about 18 to 24 months, and then development flattens out. And then there's regression, and that's where a baby develops absolutely normally and then regresses far below what it was earlier in its development. As they become adolescents, they have difficulties developing and maintaining friendships, communicating with their peers and adults, and they have a difficult time at school and holding jobs. And they may come to the attention of health care providers because they have a higher proportion that show depression, anxiety, and hyperactivity. It occurs more often, higher proportion of folks with ASD as opposed to in the general population. It's important to note that it's not a stable condition. It varies over time. Sometimes it can decrease over time with treatment. Sometimes it gets worse. Sometimes it's good and bad. Some people with ASD live independently, go to college. Others have severe disabilities requiring full-time, lifelong care and support. And the demands on those families that have to provide that care and support can be quite significant. It's important that we as a society recognize these folks, and to what extent we feel we have an obligation, we should be committed to accepting them and to providing treatment. New Jersey happens to be quite good at that. When a child is identified as autistic, they can get treatment with support from the state government. And when they go into school, if they can be mainstreamed, they are mainstreamed with special support. My wife worked for 15 years working with adolescents pre-K through second grade. And it is possible to mitigate the progression of autism with some treatments. But diagnosing autism has to be done through observation. You can't give a blood test, you can't give a genetic test, or any other kind of test to say, you have autism. It's observation of development, observation of behavior. And if it's done correctly, it can be identified as early as 18 to 24 months so that intervention can be done. But unfortunately, some do not get a diagnosis too much later and thus miss out on early help. Basic steps in diagnosing ASD consist of monitoring, screening, and then finally a diagnosis. The monitoring, as you can imagine, is an ongoing process of watching a child grow. It's a responsibility of the parents, and conversations between healthcare providers, their pediatrician, for instance, and the parents, asking questions. Is your child doing this? Is your child doing that? At particular times in their development. Then there's screening. And this is a more formal look at the child's development. And it's part of well care visits, even when there's no concern. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that developmental behavioral screening for all children be done at 9, 18, and 30 months, and specifically for autism at 18 and 24 months. And the screening involves checklists and questionnaires of the parents or caretaker. And they're looking at language, movement, behaviors, emotions, thinking skills, and so on. And if the child is at high risk for autism, or if they find behaviors sometimes associated with autism, additional screening is done. If that screening tool identifies areas of concern, then a formal developmental evaluation will be done by a trained specialist. It involves further testing, further observation, and more questioning of the parents and caregivers. The results of that evaluation will highlight the strengths and challenges of that child and can inform whether or not that child actually is autistic. What used to be separate things like ADHD and Asperger's syndrome and autism are now under the one spectrum idea. The diagnosis then informs what kind of treatment can be done, and we'll talk about treatment in a minute. And particularly in New Jersey, but in many states, it will form a basis for what's called an IEP, which is a developmental plan for kids in school. Scientific evidence says that there are many factors that put a child at greater risk for autism. They're environmental, they're biologic, and they're genetic. You have a sibling or parent with ASD, you're more likely to be affected by autism. If you have certain genes, if you go through a complicated birth, and if you're born to older parents. For instance, there's about a 40% higher chance than the typical population, the younger parent population, of having an autistic child. Doesn't mean that 40% will have it. It's 40% over the 3.5 per 100 that are diagnosed. So let's talk about some of the possible genetic causes. It's generally accepted that autism symptoms result in changes in various systems of the brain during the very earliest parts of maturation. Mutations that affect the development of the brain as an organ and also affect the nerves that feed the brain information. And it's also fairly clear that some risk for autism is heritable. As I said, 3.5 out of 100 children are diagnosed in the United States with autism. A meta-study done by Lord in 2018 estimated that between 74 and 98% of the risk for autism is heritable. For instance, having one or both parents with autism increases the risk of having an ASD child by as much as 80%. If the parents have one autistic child, they have an 8% chance of having a second child who's autistic. If the autistic child is an identical twin, it's a very high likelihood that the identical twin will be autistic. And if it's a fraternal twin, it's less, but still a 31% chance that the fraternal twin will be autistic. But a large number of people who get ASD have no family members who have ASD. And that suggests that there are spontaneous mutations that occur very, very early on in the germ cells during meiosis. That's the sperm and the ovum when they divide very early, okay? That may cause the anomalies that lead to autism. The mutation is not present in the parental genome, but it can be inherited by future generations. But understanding the genetic basis is complex. It's unclear whether autism is explained more by rare mutations that cause major effects or a lot of mutations that interact to cause the effects. Only small effects can be attributed to one gene, less than 1% in any particular one. Most of them are less than 0.1%. But the research suggests that the genes that are involved with autism do several things to the brain and the nervous system. It controls protein synthesis in neuronal cells. That's the neurons. It controls the activity, the division, and the adhesion of those cells. It controls synapse formation, where the communication from nerve cells is transmitted. And it controls the biochemical atmosphere environment that would cause excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmission balance. Much of the evidence points to a dysfunction of the synapse as the cause. Some rare mutations can disrupt those synaptic pathways. There's also some evidence that agents that cause birth defects are related to ASD, but they only appear to act during the first 8 weeks after conception. So it's in utero. In the neurophysiology, there are studies that support the concept that ASD may involve a combination of brain enlargement in some areas and reduction in other areas. Let's see if we get this. So here is a typical brain. Here is an early onset brain, and it is bigger, okay? And it's hard to see here, but there are some structural differences in the different sectors of the brain. Here in regressive autism, it's much bigger. So this abnormal neuronal growth can leave some areas of the brain with too many neurons and other areas with too few. And the abnormalities are found typically in the frontal lobe, the mirror neuron system, the limbic system, temporal lobe, and corpus callosum. When they do MRIs and PETs, they can see that a person with autism exhibits less activation in what's called the primary and secondary somatosensory cortices. And the SSC uses sensory information from outside the brain to initiate important movements and responses required to deal with particular situations, such as tactile information. That information is projected to the SSC, which connects with other brain areas to process the sensory information. The fact that there's less response in the SSC coincides with reports demonstrating abnormal patterns of cortical thickness and gray matter volume in those regions of ASD people's brains. And this is here's where the SSC is. Their speech activation is different in ASD, and that's in Broca's area. Here. In some neuroimaging studies, they've shown abnormal connectivity, and the degrees of this abnormality directly correlates with the severity of the autism that the patient has. There is abnormal preferential processing. So the left and the right brain are involved in processing in typical individuals. In those with autism, there is a priority to the right side of the brain. The right side of the brain deals with details. Left side of the brain sort of synergizes those details into a wider perception of what is going on. Now, we talk about left-handed brain and right-handed brain. This is not that. And by the way, that'd be a whole nother talk. Left-handed and right-handed brains, it's a myth. So this research supports observation of preferential processing of details on the right side of the brain with individual components of sensory information over global processing of sensory information in the ASD brain. People with autism focus on little things and miss the big picture. So this may be a neurophysiological underpinning of that. Pre, peri, and postnatal environmental elements, low birth weight, more than 10% below the normal birth weight, could affect the fetal neurodevelopment. Intrauterine growth restrictions are associated with it in both term and preterm babies. Inflammatory and autoimmune diseases are correlated with the damaging of fetal tissues and may aggravate a genetic problem or affect the nervous system. And there is a little bit of evidence that says that exposure to heavy metals and particulates in pollution may increase the risk of ASD. The gut-brain axis, that's your intestines and the brain, there may be abnormalities in that. A lot of study has been done over the last 15 years to show that your general emotional health and your general brain health depends on a healthy colon and small intestine. And if it's healthy, then there are signals that are sent from the intestine to the brain that affect behavior and affect emotion. So the neural connections and the immune system are a pathway that allows diseases that originate in the intestine to cause brain inflammation and dysfunction, like Crohn's disease. Even a gastrointestinal inflammation, a mix of the flora You know, we all have bacteria and other things in our intestine, and if it's out of balance, it can cause disease. And how food is metabolized. Very important. Vaccines don't cause autism, period. There was a study done in England, supposedly done by Andrew Wakefield in 1998. It was published in The Lancet that said that there was an increased risk of autism due to the preservative thimerosal and aluminum that was contained in inactive MMR vaccines, measles, mumps, and rubella. It turned out it wasn't scientific, and in fact, he was trying to sell a test for enterocolitis, which at that time was thought to be one of the risks factors for autism. There is no evidence, based on many, many studies that have been done around the world, that MMR or any other childhood vaccine increases the risk of ASD. But as we know from looking around society, you know, there's an awful lot of anti-vax activity out there, and it's hurting our herd immunity to things like measles and polio. Other environmental factors, certain foods, infectious diseases, pesticides, flame retardants, alcohol, and so on. Those have been claimed to be environmental causes. There is no evidence that any of these increase the risk for autism. Current treatment and management tries to reduce the symptoms that interfere with daily functioning and the quality of life. Because it affects each person, autism affects each person differently, with unique strengths and challenges, the treatment plans have to be aimed specifically at the individual. And as they grow into adolescence and adulthood, then additional services have to be provided. Many types of treatment available: behavioral, developmental, educational, social relational, pharmacological, psychological, and complementary and alternative treatments. To the behavior, the result of the behavior, to see if the behavior itself can be changed. The leading approach with that is called ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis. I know that my wife used that extensively. Developmental approaches focus on improving specific developmental skills like physical skills and language skills. Occupational therapy teaches skills that help the person live independently. The Early Start Denver model is a broad developmental approach that involves ongoing play between the child and the parents and caregivers and experts to try to improve language, social, and learning skills. Social relational treatments try to improve social and emotional abilities. But unfortunately, there are no medications that can treat the core symptoms of ASD. All that you can do is help mitigate some of the symptoms. So things like high energy levels, inability to focus, self-harming behavior can be treated with certain types of drugs. You can give anxiety medications, antidepressants, and also if there's seizures that are involved or sleep problems, those can also be medicated, but it's not going to affect the underlying autism. Psychological approaches, cognitive behavior therapy, for instance, focuses on learning the connections between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. These are complementary and alternative treatments that are often used to supplement more traditional approaches. Animal therapy, arts therapy, mindfulness, and relaxation, those have some evidence that they can mitigate the behaviors. There's no evidence of effect from special diets, gluten-free, no sugar, organic, so on, herbal supplements, and even chiropractic. No effect on those. So we've talked about what autism is, where it may come from, how it can be treated. Now I want to focus on the language. The debate has erupted over language among scientists that study autism, amongst parents and caregivers, and even amongst individuals who have autism themselves. For instance, should researchers describe ASD as a disorder, a disability, or a difference? Should researchers describe its associated features as symptoms or traits? In scientific papers and commentaries published over the last year, some have decried ableist language amongst their colleagues, and others have defended traditional terminology. And both sides claim they have the best interests of autistic individuals in mind. Researchers on all sides of this language controversy report coming under attack. Vitriolic Twitter exchanges, remarks at conferences being shouted down during presentations, scathing letters in professional journals, and those of you that write in journals know that's possibly the worst. Researchers have been getting more and more reluctant to give public presentations or be too vocal about what they're finding. There's a deep divide in the autism community. On one side are the parents of children with severe traits, severe intellectual disabilities, limited or no language ability, self-harm, multiple comorbidities, and it's a condition that needs very, very intense and sometimes costly treatment. On the other side are those who support what they call neurodiversity. And those are usually individuals who are caretakers or are the individuals themselves who have much, much milder presentations. They maintain that autism is a neurological difference and a disability. It's not a disorder. And that society needs to learn how to accept and accommodate rather than try to prevent or cure. You can think in an analogy how society has changed as far as people who are what used to be called handicapped in wheelchairs and so on. We now have ramp regulations. We have door regulations. We have elevator regulations and so on. Those folks who are supportive of neurodiversity would like to see something similar for individuals with autism. So the traditional camp calls neurodiversity advocates privileged and naive because they have very, very mild presentations. But the neurodiversity camp says parents are ableist and they're failing their autistic children. Think, for instance, by analogy again, deaf parents who have deaf children. There's a controversy about whether those children should be taught American Sign Language or whether they should just continue to be deaf. In one case, those who advocate American Sign Language, they would be comparable to the ableist. You say being deaf is a disorder. Let's give you a tool to help mitigate that. Those who want to remain deaf say, hey, we've got a fine view of the world the way that we are. You need to accommodate us. So this debate is grounded in the belief that by some researchers and people that word choices can affect the subjects, those who have autism, the design of the research, and the way that those experimental results are interpreted. Accusations often characterize certain terms and descriptions as ableist. Some autism research in the field often default to terms they deem as having negative connotations. The yellow ones here are the negative ones. Symptom instead of trait, disorder instead of difference, comorbid instead of co-occurring. People with autism instead of autistic person. The identity first approach tends to convey individual strengths. So that would be autistic person, whereas person first, people with autism convey as weakness. Now, my son is a linguist, and I've had this conversation with him. I don't see it, but he says it's true. So there are checklists that are given to people to consider when they're doing research and when they're interfacing with folks with autism. Would I use this language if this was a neurotypical person? Does my language suggest that autistic people are inherently inferior? Does my language suggest that autism is something to be fixed, cured, and so on? Does my language unnecessarily other autistic people by suggesting that the characteristics of autism bear no relationship to the characteristics of non-autistic people? This is a brochure from an Australian neurodiversity group that gives a checklist to parents and researchers of what is potentially offensive and what is preferred language. Botha, in 2022, she is mildly autistic herself and studies autism. She did a recent survey of almost 200 autism researchers, sending them questionnaires about their research and their findings. And in her analysis, 60% of the responses included views about autistic people deemed to be dehumanizing, objectifying, and stigmatizing. Some research claimed that ableist language and mindset trickles down to the design of experiments and research. In studies testing interventions, for example, researchers rarely track adverse reactions such as physical harm or psychological distress. And it suggests that many researchers see ASD people as less than human. Even the most widely used therapy, ABA, is seen as a harmful tool of trying to normalize an autistic child. Many ASD people and their families have instead embraced the view that their difficulties lie not with autism, but with society. However, many researchers push back very hard, saying that censoring language stifles the scientific process. Here's a quote from one of the researchers. If you can't use words like challenging behaviors or severe disorder or symptoms, then how are you supposed to study those things? Using neutral terminology downplays the experiences of severely autistic individuals who have communication problems, intellectual inabilities, and other critical health. And it trivializes the severity of ASD for those individuals. Another quote, no one should have the power to censor language to exclude the observational realities of autism. So some researchers are worried that neutral language would move research away from exploring ASD's underlying biological causes and potential treatments, and instead would focus on services and support for ASD people. And the argument is about whether or not this would be a positive or negative change for those folks with autism. There are good points on both sides. The neurodiversity movement involves parents fighting for society's acceptance of their children and to get accommodations for them. And there are good points on both sides. The real difference is whether or not you're accounting for the severity, the differences in severity. There's a wide abyss between someone who's very mildly impaired and someone who's very severely impaired with intellectual disability and all the comorbid conditions that tend to cluster at the more severe presentation of the disorder. So the debate is continuing. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you. I have a friend who's autistic, so this is very, very informative to me. A couple of questions. The demographics of the average autistic person, how long do they live? Male, female, race orientation, things of that nature, if you could do. And secondly, my understanding, and this is not great understanding, a lot of autistic people suffer from Alzheimer's disease. Is that true or not? What is the comorbidity frequency among late stage autistic children? Thank you.
Let's talk about the demographics first. Overall, 3.5% of the population in America, children, are diagnosed with autism. If you look at Europe, it's about 2.5%. If you look at Australia, it's about 1.5%. China is about 2.5%. So we have a higher incidence. Now, is it because of something environmental going on, or is it that we diagnose differently? I can't answer that. It's about a 2.5 to 1 ratio of male to female those that present autistic symptoms. In terms of race, slightly higher in African Americans than whites and Hispanics. As far as the Alzheimer's question, I can't answer that. I haven't looked at any research. Off the top of my head, I would be surprised if there's any connection, because the putative causes of Alzheimer's are totally different from the genetic and other neurophysical changes that occur in autistic individuals.
We have a question online. Alejo?
Oh, first, thank you very much for a most informative and intriguing talk. I might be asking a potentially offensive question, but is it possible to define normal human behavior? And the reason I ask this is that there's a lot of talk today in artificial intelligence circles about regulating artificial intelligence systems, saying that the systems tend to be biased and don't reflect normal human behavior. Do you think it's possible to define normal human behavior and thus regulate AI?
Let me just touch on the first question. Can you define normal? Depends who you ask. So it's possible to look at a number of different characteristics of being human: physiological, emotional, behavior, size, weight, and so on, and come up with means. So does that mean if you're within 2 standard deviations of all of those, are you normal? That's one way of looking at it. And in fact, much scientific research that goes into behavior and responses to medications and so on and so forth uses that sort of statistical approach. But in democratic societies, there is there's an objection to determining, to saying this is normal and this isn't normal. There's a sort of flattening out. And that's sort of where neurodiversity is coming from. They're saying, okay, we might be out on the edge of the normal curve in several conditions, but in fact, we're just seeing the world differently. I'm forgetting the doctor that did the man who mistook his wife for a hat. What was his name? Sachs, right? Oliver Sacks. He wrote several books about savants, severe autists, Tourette syndrome. And what he tried to do was live in their world to see how they saw the world, and tried to build a 3-dimensional sort of geography of how they work their way through the world. And he came to the conclusion there's lots of ways of being normal. So there's a political question, a philosophical question, a scientific question. Now, as far as AI, that may be beyond me. I've used AI for a couple of things. It's fun when you are making pictures. It's less successful when you're trying to do research. So whether that represents abnormal or not normal brain processes or parallel brain processes, I can't answer that question.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on that, on Alejo's question. I don't know if you're familiar with a popular book by Temple Grandin. You are. She claims to be, I guess, a high-functioning autistic person. And she's been very successful in certain enterprises. She says that people like her have a different way of thinking. Now, I'm saying thinking, not perceiving. She says her actual thought process is pictorial. That means it uses pictures, it uses patterns, and it's more spatial. So that is her actual thinking process, according to her. Contrast that with how our schools are run and how society is run based on verbal thinking. So verbal thinking is, of course, it uses language, and it is syllogistic, it's sequential. One thing follows from another. She claims she doesn't think that well. I'd like your reaction to that and how you think it fits in with the research that you've mentioned.
I don't know how many of you know Temple Grandin, but she is the world's foremost inventor and designer of abattoirs. And that's what she decided to do. And she was interested in that all of her life. She is considered high functioning. And I have read that book, and I think it's just as valid a way of thinking. There's a lot of study on what intelligence is. And if you look at things like standard IQ tests, a lot of it is verbal, a lot of it is sequential logic, even the spatial things that are done. Reward individuals who think in a sequential, verbal, logical way. But there's a lot of studies that there are other kinds of intelligence that are not picked up. There is pictorial, there is musical, there is emotional intelligence. And all of those could be considered valid approaches to seeing the world. So my reaction to it is, if it works for her, that's great. Do we have the right to say it's wrong? I don't think so. But again, she would be a supporter of neurodiversity. Just one more point that occurs to me. A lot of research has been done over the last 10 years about verbal communication with those with severe language deficits. My wife, for instance, was an early user of special laptops that would put pictures up, and the autistic kids would be able to form sentences with them. There's a book that came out recently, I can't remember what the gentleman's name is, that basically mitigated most of his severe impact. And when he discovered it when he was about 16 or 17 years old, when one of the caretakers showed him, he was suddenly able to write and describe what was going on. And it turned out the verbal deficit and the inability to communicate was the major obstacle to him functioning in the world. So.
My question is actually a follow-up to this too. I think probably most people who are not very well informed on this subject think that autism is a disability, and the people with autism are leading diminished lives and can't be successful, and so on and so forth. And yet, as you point out, some people who are autistic are fabulously successful in life. And I know of several myself. One of them is Evgeny Kissin, who is absolutely one of the best pianists in the world. And he's my favorite pianist. And I was watching him play some amazingly difficult stuff. He's Russian. Another is Daryl Hannah, an actress. And acting is verbal. So it doesn't necessarily prevent you from being successful. So I just Googled for a few more. And believe it or not, Anthony Hopkins, Charles Darwin, Elon Musk, Steven Spielberg, and possibly even Bill Gates. Yeah. So, so I'm wondering whether, being fabulously successful is, some ordinary people are and some autistic people are. And, what are the ratios of autistic people who just go on and be fabulously successful one way or another? Or, I mean, I suppose in a few cases, being autistic might actually contribute to their success. Like he's he's practiced the piano all his life instead of interacting with people and so on. Maybe you could comment on that.
I think that's a great hypothesis that what would be perceived as deficits in behavior or abilities can in some cases enhance someone's ability to be successful, assuming that being successful is a good measure. The important thing is to understand how that might apply to a person with very, very severe autism. As they've learned from some of the research, there may be ways of mitigating that and breaking through and helping that individual to better integrate with the world. I won't say necessarily with society, but be able to build a world that they can operate on. The son of one of my very good friends has fairly severe autism, amongst other comorbidities, including blindness and so on. And he is in a home for kids that, and he's 19 now, but he's in a home for young adults in Florida, where they measure or they figure out what his ability is and then build a world for him to operate in and to be happy in. Now, is happiness the ultimate goal? Comfort? Maybe, but it's also people that are inside the severe experience of autism, in some cases aren't aware that they have severe autism. The one individual that I mentioned before who discovered the ability to get voice through this verbal laptop stuff, he in fact was because he felt he could be normal in the world, except for the fact that he couldn't communicate what he wanted to communicate. So nobody could see his heart and mind, and he could see everybody else's. And it was very frustrating for him that they couldn't make the bond.
Mitch, you want to come up for the next?
A couple of quick questions, I think. Anyway, there's been a lot of emphasis in a variety of different ways researching the use of psychedelic drugs as a treatment for this, that, and thing. Are you seeing any of that being done in the Asperger's or the autism spectrum? And then Asperger's, it slipped out of my mouth. 10, 20 years ago, that was a common thing to talk about. And then now you can't. And can you talk a little bit about the process that the medical community went through to change this whole paradigm? It must have been contentious, and it seems to me to be fairly rapid.
First of all, with regard to hallucinogenics, there have been some studies that have been done. I've never read anything that indicates that it's been successful. It's very risky because hallucinogenics, more than other kinds of drugs, affect the nervous system and affect the brain functioning. So why would it be smart to add that complication into it? There has been work with dopamine and other biochemicals, neurotransmitters, to see if it can have effect on the putative neuron deficits that people with autism have. And some of that is used in treatments, particularly for tremors, stimming, siloing, and so on. As far as the process of the shift from a disorder to a spectrum disorder, I read a little bit about the WHO approach to it. The difficulty that folks were having was how to diagnose something specifically. As I mentioned, there's Canner's, there's Asperger's, there's ADHD, there's what was called autism at that time. These are all conditions that have overlapping behaviors. So you might be able to misdiagnose something as Canner's when in fact it was just ADHD. So now all of those things in the spectrum, you remember that circle that I had that had several attributes around it. Now all of those are considered as one disorder. And it's just the degree to which you may present language issues, behavioral issues, and so on. I don't remember anything related to this language issue because this was done before this really blew up. And if you remember, both the ICM and the DMA call it a disorder. Who knows what will happen in the next editions, which are due in about 4 or 5 years. I don't know if that answers your question. Anything else? Okay.
My son is severely autistic. He's in a group home with the ARC of Union County and Scotch Plains at the moment. My wife took gas when he was born, and she was knocked out for an hour and a half. It was incredible. We thought he was epileptic in the beginning. He had spasms and was being treated for that for quite a while. And finally, a woman doctor in Scotch Plains, I think it was, discovered he had a subdural hematoma. And they did a series of 17 taps on his brain to relieve the pressure. And that did stop the seizures. He's got an incredible memory. You can ask him, what happened on a TV show or who starred in it years ago, and he can come up with it. It's incredible, his memory. But and the eye contact thing is very obvious, lack of eye contact. Anyway, I just thought I'd introduce that because I've been very close to it for a lot of my life.
In this case, maybe I'm not a medical doctor and I don't know the details, but it sounds like an environmental cause related to a difficult birth that may have damaged part of the brain and had an effect on its future development. So, thank you.
By the way, Einstein was on that list too. Here's a totally unrelated question, somewhat unrelated. Is autism a uniquely human condition, or has this kind of behavior been observed in other species?
In fact, it has been seen in primates. Not a lot of work is done further down. Usually, if an animal is misbehaving, if it's a farm animal, it's just destroyed. So, but there are analogs to it. And one of the things to think about, this is other stuff that I lecture on occasionally, is the idea of using animal models to actually try and do testing with. And primates are very difficult to do. It's very expensive. They have a very long gestation period. There aren't very many of them. There are ethical issues sometimes that are brought up. But like is being done now with kidney transplants and heart transplants, the pig is being used because its size and in generally the physiology of those major organs are similar to human. So it may be that more research will be done in pigs to see if they can induce autism by doing certain things and even discover autism in pigs. I'm not aware of anything of that being done right now.
I think this will be the last question.
wanted to pick up on some of your demographic reviews, and you mentioned that there's a differential in the rate in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, China. Also, have there been studies about the differential rates in various states of our 50 states? Because I have heard that New Jersey has the highest rate. I don't know if that's substantially true, but if it is, that raises a question of to what extent environmental pollutions or toxins of some sort may be a factor in this.
Looking at the state data, it's very confusing. Yes, New Jersey is high, Connecticut is high, California is high, particularly Southern California. Okay, but so is Mississippi, Alabama, Oklahoma. So there may be environmental things that are involved, but they may be different environmental things. So you might say, well, because we're more industrialized in New Jersey, at least in northern New Jersey, that perhaps something related to industrialization is causing it. But that wouldn't affect rural Mississippi, which doesn't have a lot of industry except along the Gulf Coast. So what other environmental things might be going on? So it's hard to make a correlation between any specific environmental thing and the incidence. So New Jersey is roughly about 4.5, but also understand that that is sullied by the fact that New Jersey is a destination state for parents to bring their kids who have autism because of the great programs they have here and the financial support.
Thank you so much. This is so interesting. It gets more interesting the more we talk about it. Stuart, please come up. Don't go away. Stuart, please come up and speak thank our speaker.
Thank you very much for a really informative and challenging talk. We have two ways of thanking our speakers. The first is a certificate of appreciation, which has an orchid on it. And in 1930, Summit was the orchid capital of the East. And the second way that we have is to give an old guard salute to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for keeping up with what was a ton of information.